If it could be said that Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey is the greatest science fiction film of all time, then it is my opinion that his film The Shining is the greatest horror film of all time, because it does exactly what a horror film should do. That is to say, it deals with the astral plane. And the astral plane is the realm of ghosts and demons and spirits that the dead person basically experiences in the Tibetan Book of the Dead after death. But it can also intersect with the physical world. And the nexus point for the meeting of the underworld and the upper world in this case is set in this isolated hotel. And here we see the facade of a real hotel. This is the Timberline Lodge on the south side of Mount Hood. And here Kubrick opens his film with the immensity of the American wilderness, almost as a sort of contrast to the immensity of outer space that dwarfs human beings into insignificance in 2001: A Space Odyssey. And here we see the tiny little VW bug here dwarfed into insignificance by the vastness of the majesty of the untamed American wilderness. And here we see our protagonists, this little domestic family of the father, who is the frustrated writer, and the mother and the son. And the first sort of paranormal experience that Danny has in the hotel is he sees this archaic mythic image of these two girls who are twins, but the image reminds me of the ancient archaic image of the two-headed goddess that originated in the Neolithic. The Neolithic was the period of agriculture, and the two-headed goddess first puts in her appearance at that time, and what she represented was life and death. The one represented life and the one represented death, and by the time the two arrive into ancient Greece, they become separated into two entities, Demeter and Persephone. In Egypt, this is Isis and Nut. Each one is the mistress of the world of life, and the other is the mistress of the world of death, which is an appropriate image for this film since we're going to be entering into the land of the dead here. Now here we see Jack Torrance trying to work out a relationship with his muse, and we see these Native American gods, these Navajo deities up on the wall like presiding spirits, and he's sort of frustrated, and it's almost as though the spirits are blocking his creativity there, and he's sort of hurling the ball at them in frustration. The wife and son, meanwhile, decide to go out for a stroll in a hedge maze, and this is one of Kubrick's great innovations in the story. The hedge maze does not occur in Stephen King's novel. But the labyrinth is interesting because the labyrinth traditionally is an image that is associated with the land of the dead. There is a Malaculan, in the Malaculan journey of the dead, the initiate would go and travel along a river, and finally he would come to this goddess of the dead, and she would draw half of a labyrinth on the ground, and the initiate would have to complete the other half of the labyrinth. And if he couldn't complete that labyrinth, then she would swallow him up. But if he was able to, if he had memorized the labyrinth and was able to complete it, then he could continue on into the land of the dead. And the main purpose, though, for labyrinths is to trap monsters inside them. And you already get this sense of the labyrinth as trapping a monster in the story of Theseus and Ariadne and the Minotaur. The Minotaur is at the center of the labyrinth, and he is the monster that the labyrinth traps inside of it. And the children are fed to the Minotaur, just as here there's a danger of Danny, the child, being fed to the ogre. And here Kubrick sort of underscores this image of Jack as a sort of giant, an ogre, like something out of a fairy tale, like, say, Jack and the Beanstalk, as he looks over this miniature model of the labyrinth, and here we see an aerial view. And it's almost as though Kubrick is emphasizing the gulf, the two different spaces between Jack on the one hand, who's sort of beginning to detach and occupy his own space, and his wife and son, who are beginning to live in their own landscape. And here he is now slowly beginning to become isolated and to devolve. If 2001: A Space Odyssey is about the evolution of human consciousness onward and upward to a higher state, The Shining is the study of the devolution of human consciousness, of how the individual can gradually lose hold of his ego, and it can become permeable to spirits and monsters from the astral plane that can then seize possession of him. And here the two-headed goddess puts in an appearance again, only in this case she is now in the role of the death goddess, and Danny begins to pick up visions of a murder that once took place, a murder that is going to be recapitulated by Jack as he slowly becomes possessed by these ancient evil spirits. Now notice that the green on the walls here, green is normally a symbol of life and of vegetation and burgeoning, but here it turns out that he has been kissing a woman who is really death incarnate, wearing the mask of life. As he looks at her in the mirror, she turns out to be a corpse. And once again, the goddess of death makes another appearance here. She is the presiding mistress over this nexus between the underworld and the upper world in this narrative. Here she is a rotting corpse, and Danny is trying very hard to send a telepathic message to the cook Halloran to come and help them. He has already had an encounter at this point with this evil spirit who has tried to strangle him. And here she is sort of left behind in the tub as a murder that has occurred and left a sort of astral residue, a karmic trace on the hotel itself as a nexus between two worlds. Now, I chose this scene because the walls are painted red, and it's a kind of interesting evocation of the ancient Neolithic practice of painting walls and floors inside of houses red. And traditionally, the underworld has been associated with the color red, but originally that may be a carryover from these Neolithic houses where the walls and floors were painted red because they may have represented the menstrual blood. Now, the menstrual blood at that time was not regarded with the kind of revulsion which our society tends to regard menstrual blood with these days. Then it was regarded that the woman stopped menstruating when she became pregnant because she was using that blood to reconstruct the embryo, a brand new embryo. And so it became the practice when the dead were buried to sprinkle red ochre on them as symbolic of the menstrual blood, because the menstrual blood would be thought then to reconstruct a new body for the dead person. And so it's interesting how the red on the walls echoes that underworld theme of death and rebirth. And here Jack is slowly beginning to devolve. He's beginning to lose it. His ego is beginning to become weak and fragile and beginning to be invaded by spirits from the astral plane who are now planning in his head ideas of murder and death. And he is becoming the sort of big bad wolf from the Little Red Riding Hood story. He is the monster at the center of the labyrinth. And it is almost as though the goal of the narrative is for Danny to lead him as a monster into the labyrinth and leave him there so that he becomes trapped, thereby fulfilling the function of the story, which is that the labyrinth traps monsters and demons inside of it. And here the cook Halloran, who arrives to help them, is immediately murdered. And we note that this is the only murder that takes place in the film. Halloran just happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time here, and Jack has now fully been taken over by evil spirits. At this point, he has an axe and a limp, and the limping hero is associated with the moon. And the axe also traditionally is associated with the moon, especially the double axe, the Cretan double axe, where one blade is associated with life and the other blade is associated with death. And then the narrative reaches its telos, its goal, its fulfillment here, as Danny leads the evil spirit that his father has unfortunately become to the center of the labyrinth, and he has become frozen, and winter has overtaken him.